My name is Arlene Vetere. I'm a systemic psychotherapist, a systemic supervisor, and a clinical psychologist. And currently, my academic post is in Oslo, in Norway, where I'm professor of family therapy and systemic practice. When I was 11, my father was killed. And it was like somebody pulled the rug out from underneath my mum. She changed unrecognizably. And one of the things she did in her grief, I think, was cut my brother and I, because I have a brother, cut us off from her extended family and my father's extended family. So being a curious person in every sense of the word, I was always interested in other people's families. So I always wanted to study psychology to figure out how do people tick? What's this all about? So my first degree was in 1968, and that was when behaviorism was rife, and there was a lot of animal models of learning, and it really just didn't tick those boxes. But as it happened, I got married, I had children, and I stayed at home with my kids until the youngest was ready to go to primary school. Then I went back to university, again to read psychology, and the world had changed. This time, psychology was much more about people in terms of how they learn, how they develop, and so on. And I had the great good fortune in my final year of undergraduate study to meet Tony Gale. Tony Gale was a psychophysiologist, but he'd been working in Swansea, had moved to Southampton where I did my degree. But when he was in Swansea, he was approached by Amelia Dowling and Sue Walren Skinner, who were currently studying at the Cardiff Institute at that time, to supervise their masters. And so he got interested in family process. So in the final year of the psychology degree, he was running a seminar on the family. So guess who signed up? And I haven't looked back because following that, I was able to do a PhD, and my PhD was on family process. And what I did was, I was inspired by Jules Henry's work. He was an anthropologist living with families where somebody had a diagnosis of psychosis. But I wanted to study family life. Of course I did. I wanted to understand how do families do family. So for 3 years, I was a participant observer living with families who would allow me to come into their home for a week at a time. I could see things that were happening that were causing distress. And of course, my role was passive in the sense that I couldn't actively make suggestions. I mean, clearly my presence is a stimulus, clearly, but I wasn't in a position where I could, wonder about, how come it's like this, or have you thought of, or so I became more and more frustrated with the research role as observer and decided to train as a clinical psychologist. And I sort of never looked back, really, sort of trained as a therapist. My training originally was with Andy Treacher, and he was very interested in structural family therapy at that time. In those days, I say in those days, but it was a while ago, actually, there was really, I think, almost not infighting, that's the wrong word, but really quite strong positions around which was a proper model or the best model. Andy was often seen as a bit of a bête noire in the family therapy community. You'd go to a conference and it would be Andy who would be standing up in the audience asking a critical question, not negatively critical, but a critical question. So he introduced me to Minuchin and Minuchin's ways of working. And I think one of the things that I found really interesting about that was how Minuchin tried to deconstruct people's roles and responsibilities in families and what happened if they got overwhelmed or if it wasn't clear who was doing what. But the thing that puzzled me about it was that Minuchin had such a focus on the here and now, which I thought was really valid, because for some family work, that is sufficient, what's going on right now. But I was always curious about how does it get to be like that? And you can see the origins of that curiosity and me always being puzzled about what happened to my mum. How come when my dad died, my mum became unrecognizable to me as a child? So I was always interested in, so what's the story? How did it come to be like this? And intergenerationally, what's going on? Because we were cut off from extended family for so many years, I was always curious about, what was there in my mum's childhood that led her to respond like that? So that got me interested in John Byng Hall and his very early ideas around corrective and replicative scripts. And of course, John Byng Hall was one of the first UK family therapists to seriously bring attachment theory in. So my introduction to attachment theory was way back. And my interest in it was always around safety and danger. What is dangerous in a relationship? And when the person who's in the room with you is both the cause of your distress and the source of a solution to your distress, that it was that involved me and fascinated me. So way back then, I was always wanting to integrate ideas. So, and I could see that systemic models allowed integration. They facilitated it because systemic theory is a meta theory, is a theory of theory. It's a theory of how you connect theory. So I could always see that although some people might have been getting a bit like, well, this is the proper way to do it and you guys don't do it well, or you guys boss family around, or whatever it is the criticisms were, I could actually see that in the theory, it enabled the bringing together of ideas in a way that when you sat down with people and thought about, so what's happening and what do you want to do about it and how did it get to be like this, you didn't have to be model specific. Jan and I would meet at AFT conferences, and you know how it is. You are attracted to some people because you've got common interests or whatever. And we'd end up in the bar at AFT conferences having a glass of wine and moaning about work. And the moan was consistent, and it was in the people we're working with. There is unresolved trauma. There's a lot of it, and it's not being well understood. Because at that time, we're talking about the early 90s, the neuroscience around trauma was just beginning to come into the public domain. But we were aware that many of the people we worked with were struggling with unresolved trauma responses, didn't understand them, family didn't understand them. Our mental health services were not that well organized to deal with it. And then one year, I don't know how we did it, but we looked at each other and we said, enough is enough. We have to do something about this. And we set up Reading Safer Families. We called it Safer Families because we nicked that title from New York City. They were running a Safer Cities campaign at the time, and we quite liked that. And Reading, because that was the town where we were both living and working. One, I think, key principle in systemics is the triangle. Because one of the things I like about systemic theory is that the basic relationship is a triangle, not a twosome. That when any two get together, they're influenced by their separate relationships with the third, whether the third is in Australia or dead or in the living room with you. And we use that triangle a lot. So we were interested in the triangular relationship between the risk of future violence and how you understand and explain violence and hold people responsible for their behavior. And can you work collaboratively in a context like this where very often legal processes are involved? And in the UK, of course, the law is our highest context. So the triangle of how do you manage the risk of future violence whilst holding people responsible, whilst trying to get alongside and work collaboratively. And we use the triangle to think about ourselves, our clients, and another. So the other was the third, and we called them the stable third because we were interested in a stable triangle, not an unstable triangle. So the third, the stable third, could be anybody in the system who would help us meet with the family and think about safety and make the safety plan. The other way of working that we find enormously helpful is how systemically we track a process. And we're interested in episodes of violence. We're interested in times when difficult interaction and unhelpful physiological arousal becomes dangerous. And we're interested in times when you're in a difficult moment and it doesn't become dangerous. So we're interested in, obviously, people's resources and their strengths, but we also want to know when a difficult moment becomes a dangerous moment, what's triggered that. So I think systemic ways of working are enormously helpful in tracking processes between people. And of course, that was the conundrum, because it was that way of working that the feminists were very concerned held all family members equally responsible for the violence. And it was Virginia Goldner's work at the Ackerman that said very clearly, actually, you can have a conversation about explaining how the violence happens, understanding it, predicting and preventing it at the same time as having a conversation about responsibility. And one of the things Jan and I find in conversation about responsibility, because obviously these conversations are all happening at the same time, is the systemic therapies focus on use of language, how we construct experience, what language we're using, how we're using it, our nonverbal communication, and so on. And systemics is brilliant at really bringing that out. So, for example, if somebody said, I just hit him, we'd notice the minimizing word just on the one hand, but on the other hand, we'd notice the agency in I hit him. So that's been enormously helpful. And I think the emphasis on collaborative practices, particularly this notion of transparency. One of the things I love about systemic practice is the storytelling. It's one of the things that attracted me to Minuchin's work, because he was a storyteller. And the idea that you can self-disclose. We all have these dilemmas. And that's what I love about systemic thinking. It encourages self-reflexivity and reflexivity, and we share our moral dilemmas with our clients, like we're all in it together. So I think they're probably some of the key things that systemics contributes, and not least that as a meta theory, it is very interested in how we pull ideas together in a way that we can all make a shared understanding. I think, again, I want to give thanks to Tony Gale, because he was the one who suggested that we should write up the participant observation work with families in a book form. So my first introduction to extended writing was as a collaborative effort. And you'll see all my books are either jointly authored, co-authored, or co-edited. So I like to work with others. I'm not a lone worker. I've written articles on my own, but books, and I'm on to my 13th book now, and that's not counting the ones that have been translated. They're all joint, because I think that's what stimulates me. That's what helps me stay motivated, and that's where I learn best, working alongside other people, swapping ideas and getting to know your colleagues better, softening the boundaries, because you get insights into their lives that you don't see at work necessarily. So that's what I really enjoy. And then the product is of use to other people. And because I've always had an academic position, I've been required to write. But our UK universities don't particularly value books. They value peer-reviewed journal articles. So I've had to do that. But actually what I really want to do is write books, because I think practitioners are more likely to pick up a book and they might not read it cover to cover, and I include myself in that, but you pick the bits out that speak to you. And I think with a book, you can really tell some stories. You can really go into some examples that bring something to life in a way you can't so easily do in a journal article, because you've got a word count limitation and so on. I've worked in Europe a lot. I've worked in North America, and I've worked in Singapore and Hong Kong. What's amazing about working in all these countries is that by and large, they're influenced by the same ideas. So the systemic, the systemic pioneers, the early family therapists, as they were called, sociologists, psychologists, anthropologists, systems theorists. There's a broad kind of social science, health, social care, and other scientific fields. So everybody's kind of got access to that knowledge. But what fascinates me is how through different healthcare systems, some of the theories are interpreted differently or utilized differently. And in particular, the way they're used to understand and work with difference, I find so helpful. In Norway, for example, at the moment, they have a lot of unaccompanied refugee children coming into their country. I think more so than the other Scandinavian countries. And they're setting up these, what they call dialogue centres. They already have what they call children's houses. And these children's houses are places where children go, and all the people concerned to support children can go and be interviewed or work or write reports or whatever needs to happen. But they're not systemic in the way we would see it. The child is the focus. So the child's context is not the focus. So it's good that the child is the focus, but they're kind of missing something. But with this influx of unaccompanied young people, refugee young people, they've been opening up these dialogue centres that work in tandem with the children's houses. So systemic ideas are coming into the Norwegian child protection system in that way. And actually, very interestingly, a year ago, when I was at my university, I bumped into Arlene Vetere, who wrote the Monroe Report that has kind of changed the face of systemic training in systemic practice in the UK. And I thought, oh, right, okay, yep. So they're on that same journey as well. I think we need to consolidate what we have, really consolidate what we have, because I don't think it's as well established, say, as some other social care and mental health professions. The other thing that I'm really interested in, because we're seeing it more and more, is how people in organizations outside broadly health and social care and education are getting interested in systemic ideas and are particularly getting interested in the idea of why relationships are important and how to support, good working relationships and relationships of trust. I think this interest in safety, what makes relationships safe so people can trust. Because in trust, as you know, when you can rely on other people, you can give of your best and do of your best, rather than when you're, endangered, relationally endangered, unsupported, and so on. So it's interesting that large corporations, commercial business corporations, and other organizations like governments, like the stock market, are getting interested in relationships, getting interested in the neuroscience of relationships. And I think we got a great contribution to make there in terms of what safety looks like, feels like, does like, and how to support collaboration and trusting relationships. So I see that there's a very interesting future ahead of us. I just wish I was going to be here to see it.